This is Haley Solomon with the North Carolina Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining us this morning for our housing call. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our Executive Director, Samuel Gunter.
Thank you, Haley, and good morning, everyone. I hope you had a wonderful July 4th weekend. And for those of you who are impacted by the flooding, I hope that you are safe. We're going to get started with a statement about what happened before the weekend. For those of you following, on Thursday, July 3rd, Congress passed a reconciliation bill that President Trump signed into law on Friday, July 4th, that included a number of provisions that impact affordable housing and community development, including most prominently a permanent 12% increase to the low-income housing tax credit. Stephanie is going to walk us through in a minute a lot of the provisions in that bill, a more detailed breakdown of the provisions in that bill that impact the work that many of you do. And the inclusion of these provisions, has to be said at the outset, is a direct result of more than a decade of the Housing Coalition's work, your work, building bipartisan support, primarily for the Affordable Housing and Credit Improvement Act, but a number of other provisions in this bill. It says something that over the years, trying to get bipartisan support for our delegation for the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act is why this ended up in the final tax package that passed. While these provisions are important and we would normally be overjoyed and celebrate their passage, sadly, they were included in a much larger bill that will ultimately do harm to more North Carolinians than these provisions will help. And I'll quote Senator Tillis from the floor and from his statement that this is going to force the state to make some painful decisions like eliminating Medicaid coverage for hundreds of thousands of people. Congressman Ross also noted that the legislation cuts SNAP assistance by 20%, the largest cut in our nation's history. The mission of the North Carolina Housing Coalition is to lead a movement to ensure that every North Carolinian has a home in which to live with dignity and opportunity. Now, what the coalition knows best is housing policy, but we also know that stable housing, that financial security, that opportunity for families, particularly at the lowest end of the income spectrum, is about much more than just housing costs, and marginally increasing the number of units that the low-income housing tax credit can produce a year, while simultaneously stripping healthcare from more than 670,000 North Carolinians and gutting food assistance, hurts our state. And ultimately, when combined with the North Carolina General Assembly's failure to pass a budget that includes gap financing through the Workforce Housing Loan Program, the federal increase in the tax credit may not even result in more units. And so while we celebrate the work that we have done to get bipartisan support for a number of these affordable housing and community development provisions that made it into the final bill, that ultimately this bill is going to hurt far more North Carolinians than it's going to help. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie to kind of walk through in a more detailed way a number of the provisions, not just the low-income housing tax credit, but private activity bonds and new markets tax credits and on down the line, opportunity tax credit and on down the line. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie.
All right, good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and hop into this deep dive into HR 1, or the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. As Samuel mentioned, there are two really critical pieces, provisions that were added from the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act that are a good thing, but we know that in policy work, bills aren't 100% good. And unfortunately, the dangers and the negative impacts that this bill will have on our communities outweigh these good things. So in addition to those provisions for that strengthen the housing credit, there are also a few other policy changes on the tax policy side. So there is a permanent renewal and enhancement of opportunity zones. For those that don't know, opportunity zones are these designated sort of distressed community areas where special tax benefits are offered in order to encourage longer-term private investment. This can include housing development, but doesn't necessarily always include housing investment. There also is a permanent extension of the New Markets Tax Credit, which is another tool that can be used to incentivize development. It provides tax incentives for investments in low-income communities, including those focused on housing. There's also a modification on the limits to the mortgage interest deduction. There is a funding cap actually on which effectively serves as a cut for the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection. There is an increase in the percentage of real estate investment trust assets that can be held in taxable subsidiaries. That increase goes from 20 to 25%. And then there are several points at which funding is either rescinded or cut completely. One example of this is that the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program that was under the Department of Housing and Urban Development, all the unobligated funds will be rescinded from that program. The bill also eliminates several housing-related energy efficiency tax credits, such as the Energy Efficient Home Improvement Credit, the Residential Clean Energy Credit, the Energy Efficient Commercial Buildings Deduction, and the new Energy Efficient Home Credit. And in the same bill, there are numerous cuts to key social programs that are providing individuals and families with healthcare, food support, financial assistance, and more. As many of you know, because we take a comprehensive view on what it means to actually support communities, we have to highlight these cuts as well. So provisions in the bill that endanger that type of insistence include all the SNAP Ed funding for nutrition education and obesity prevention for low-income households is defunded after fiscal year 2025, so effectively done. Changes to the state cost sharing will effectively lead to program enrollment decline for SNAP. And this will end up leading to an increase in denying benefits to eligible individuals as that funding dries up, or SNAP funding essentially being unsustainable for states to plan for in the long term. Because again, and we've mentioned this several times on the call, this trend of a federal shift of policy and resource responsibility means it falls on the states. The states can only do so much, do only so much. And so there are going to be a lot of hard decisions ahead. There's a $1 trillion, trillion with a T, funding cut for Medicaid. If states keep their current Medicaid expansion programs, it would mean an additional $93 billion in federal Medicaid funding responsibilities that would be shifted to the states. Many states like ours in North Carolina, we have a trigger provision, which would require either the ending of Medicaid expansion or revisiting the expansion in the event that the federal government's matching rates drop. So if expansion is eliminated, then the enrollees that were able to get access to healthcare with the recent expansion would immediately lose their healthcare coverage. And that's over 450,000 people. And actually, as of June 25th, over 600,000 people. Additionally, something that many may not know is that Medicaid has actually increasingly been used for housing support. So states like North Carolina often use what's called the Section 115 waiver, which in addition to traditional Medicaid expenses, allows Medicaid assistance to cover health-related social needs, or HRSN. And so for housing, this may look like anything from the first month's rent to transitional housing support, accessibility modifications, eviction prevention, case management, short-term housing, stability support, and more. So all access to that funding, particularly for those that are part of the expansion population, is severely at risk and likely to end. This bill, for those that are wondering kind of how this came about, it moved under this special legislative process called reconciliation. And so this is why it primarily deals with taxes and mandatory spending programs, and that's why it includes Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, and different things like that. And that's what allows it to bypass the normal filibuster rule that would require 60 votes in the Senate. So that's just an overview. Again, two provisions that benefit the housing credit that strengthen it, and unfortunately a whole host more of provisions and cuts and rescissions of funding that will impact our communities negatively. Moving on to an advocacy opportunity, we are partnering with the National Low Income Housing Coalition and several other national partners on an organizational sign-on letter asking Congress to fully fund critical affordable housing programs in the fiscal 26 budget. So this reconciliation bill is not the appropriations bill for fiscal year 2026. That is still in flux and in process. And so this letter is specifically calling on Congress to include housing choice vouchers, project-based rental assistance, and emergency housing vouchers. There's even a letter that was signed on by the Association of U.S. Mayors that called for the funding for emergency housing vouchers as well. And just keep this in mind as these advocacy opportunities continue to ask Congress to fund these critical programs. Keep in mind all of the assistance and the resources that will be going away and the increase in need that is likely for programs like these. The deadline for signatories on this letter is July 9th. And so we have both the link to the letter in the call notes and the way for you to sign your organization's name or your name onto the letter as well. Both those links are in the call notes. Moving on to legislative updates at the state level. We mentioned last week that almost 1,800 bills, and this excludes resolutions, were introduced this session. We tracked just shy of 160 bills that we felt were related to our policy priorities and our agenda in some way. And 94 of those bills explicitly mentioned housing or were related to housing. And then the remainder were related to, the field of community development or other processes or aspects that impact housing in some way. We continue to track almost 50 bills that are related to our policy priorities that survive crossover. And we will include, we have a link in the call notes for you of our updated bill tracker of all the bills that we're tracking that made it through crossover. Last week, we highlighted House Bill 369, the Parking Modernization and Reform Bill, but we are also continuing to monitor several other bills that we believe are promising in a positive way. Bills like HB 432, Property Tax Relief Study Bill, HB 94, Disabled Veterans Homestead Exclusion Prequalification Bill. There's a Senate bill on HOA revisions. There's also several bills that have land use components to it that are really promising, like Senate Bill 205, that contain land use reform elements that could benefit supply. One of the 4 interventions that we talk about when we talk about addressing the affordable housing need. And so, for example, this bill does that by promoting ideas that could help facilitate the creation and production of a variety of housing types, and then in several ways mitigate the risk for nonprofit and affordable housing developers as they navigate the development process. Again, not every bill is perfect. Please keep an eye out for more highlights in the coming weeks where we'll explain not only what these bills are proposing, but how they could benefit housing and community development and what they don't do for housing and community development in our state. We still have no budget, so we'll continue to include that resource from the School of Government that talks about what happens when a state budget is not enacted by July 1st. Again, for a reminder, a continuing budget automatically is triggered, and so only the line items that are considered recurring allocations are funded. And so we point this out because things like the Workforce Housing Loan Program, one of our state's most critical housing resources, is not a recurring allocation. It's one of the reasons why every year we push for it to be a recurring allocation. And so we want to lift this up, and there's no WELP funding as of right now until there is a budget for the next biennium. It's also important that we mention that this does not mean that WELP is being singled out. However, we need to continue engaging with leadership in both chambers and on the Budget Conference Committee so that we can highlight the importance of this resource. They're on break currently, doing rolling skeletal sessions. So now is a great time to invite them to developments in your area and communicate why this resource is so meaningful. And then also to remind folks that this also is a key tool that can be used and is very effective when it comes not only to leveraging financial resources, but also because of its role in disaster recovery long-term. Speaking of disaster recovery, just a friendly reminder that the Renew North Carolina Single Family Housing Program has begun accepting applications. And so low to moderate income Helene survivors living in owner-occupied homes damaged by the storm can apply for assistance with housing rehabilitation or replacement. And then priority is going to be given to households with seniors that are 62 and older, children and or people with disabilities. This program is funded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, or CDBG-DR, and is administered by the North Carolina Department of Commerce. We really encourage folks to apply as soon as possible. Even though applications are open till the end of the year, funds are limited. Also, just want to add a note here for really thinking of the folks impacted by the widespread flooding caused by Tropical Depression Chantal. Different storm, definitely understand, but a lot of the communities, not limited to Chatham, Orange, Person, Durham, Lee, Moore, Alamance, and several others, are feeling the effects of this. There's already been loss of life, there have been rescues. And so just know that our thoughts are with you. And also, we are keeping an eye on a lot of the coordination that's already begun. The North Carolina volunteer organizations active in disaster have already met. They met yesterday, they're meeting again today. And we are staying tuned for more information that we can share with you throughout this process so that we can help share that information and keep you all up to date on ways that you can either help or ways that you can share resources and assistance that's available to those impacted. We have several events, reports, and resources that we want to share with you in the call notes. One that I'll lift up in particular, many of you know that we're part of the Opportunity Starts at Home cohort with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And so there will be a webinar on July 8th, that is today at 2 p.m., called Solving School Age Homelessness Through School Housing Partnerships. There is also another webinar on July 9th, that's tomorrow. It has a funny name, but it's called Curds of Wisdom, Saving the Community Reinvestment Act, and it's being hosted by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition from 1 to 2 p.m. tomorrow. We have several resources in the call notes for you as well. And as always, please don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything, if you want us to focus on something in particular, and we will continue to keep you posted. I hope you all have a great rest of your week, and we will talk to you next time.